Hey there, fellow netizens. This is Kevin in the editor's chair with a brief announcement. You might have noticed that through the course of these Pokemon episodes, we've been playing slightly differently with the format. And actually, my plan is going forward that we'll start dropping episodes more regularly throughout the month. So instead of one big episode that we release on the first Tuesday of every month, the plan going forward will be releasing slightly shorter episodes that will release on the first and third Tuesday of the month. So you get slightly more content and hopefully you'll be a little less overwhelming. I know we cover a lot of material in these episodes, and so I think spacing it out might be a better way going forward, maybe for everybody's mental health a little bit. So today's episode is one of our longer episodes, which again, like our one last month, is split up into two halves. And so you're going to hear the first half today, and the second half of this will drop 2 weeks from now on June the 20th. And the plan going forward, again, is going to have slightly shorter episodes that we post more regularly on the first and third Tuesdays of every month. So with that out of the way, let's go to the episode.
Professor Oak. Dog.
Hello, fellow netizens, and welcome to Scandalous Games, the show where we take a closer look at video game-related controversies. I'm Kevin Impellizeri, and I do the research and share a story of a video game-related controversy to my friends.
I'm Elford Stephens, a longtime video game aficionado.
I'm Andy Hunter, a longtime Pokemaniac.
I'm Kate, Pokemon Yellow aficionado.
Today, we are going to continue our long look at Pokemon fan projects and the controversy behind them. But first, we've got a new guest coming back. So, Elford, what is your experience with Pokemon?
So, I played the first Pokemon, the Game Boy version, and I played it for quite some time. I can't remember if I finished it or not. I got really into the anime when I was playing and got very familiar with Ash Ketchum and his gang. And later in life, I've gotten involved with the Pokemon card game, playing that with my kids.
Nice. I also watched a lot of the anime. It always bothered me the fact that, the whole concept of the show is catching them all. And it would always go the run where Ash would find some new Pokemon who would help him sweep through a gym or a particularly big challenge, only for a couple of episodes later for him to give it away or let it go.
It's almost like they had to keep the show going or something.
Well, or rather that they had to keep advertising the new generations of Pokemon as each new game came out. But speaking of Ash Ketchum, do any of you have strong feelings about it? Seems like the internet as a whole burst into tears recently about Ash Ketchum finally becoming a Pokemon champion and concluding his journey and handing it off to new protagonists on the TV show.
I thought you were going to say he died. I had no idea.
No, he will remain 10 years old until the end of time.
I thought you were going to say some sort of controversy. They found out Ash Ketchum's behavior behind the scenes was not up to par,
Oh, you do not want to see Ash Ketchum's Twitter feed right now. It is toxic. He's got some very strong and very complicated feelings about vaccines,
Oh.
Was he harassing Togepi on the set in season 2 or something like that?
Oh, God.
That was season 2. When did Mystique get her own Pokemon? It was a while.
Yeah, I mean, she had Pokemon when she started.
But her familiar, the way that Ash had
Oh, yeah. It was still the Kanto region when Togepi hatched and picked Misty.
It's funny, too, because I remember, because I was into the anime, too, that the internet kind of exploded when Togepi happened. Because, once Togepi was introduced on the show, everyone took to the internet and made up their own ways that you could unlock Togepi. Because Togepi wasn't
it between generations, right?
Yeah, it was before. Yeah. So Togepi was introduced before Gen 2. It was one of the first Gen 2 Pokemon introduced. And this was before Gold and Silver came out. And Gold and Silver came out in 2000. And so there were tons of rumors online of how to catch Togepi in the game. And all of them involved okay, you got to beat the Elite Four 100 times. You got to talk to this one person. There was tons of wild things. It wasn't just Togepi. There were tons of rumors of a bunch of other sort of fake and pseudo-legendary and actual legendary Pokemon. And it was one of those, it's hard to imagine in an internet age where there are no secrets anymore. But in those days where it was just when sort of internet gamer culture was coming around and message boards, and you had that combined with schoolyard gossip where all these conversations are happening and trying. I remember my cousin, it was one of those weird friend of a friend things. He claimed he had a Pokemon called Mew 6.
It's 3 times better than Mewtwo, man.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Did
it
you,
was
did you
all
think
over
that
the place.
Mew 7 was just going to be flying too close to the sun? Like, no one will believe that. That's ridiculous. Mew 6, though.
We've been talking about Pokemon fan projects a lot over the last couple of episodes. And if you haven't listened to our previous episodes, I encourage you to check them out. They're pretty fun, I think. And so in those, we learn about the world of fan-developed Pokemon adaptation. These include modifying the games to be more challenging, inserting new types and species of pocket monsters, retrofitting mechanics from more recent Pokemon titles into older games, or creating entirely new elements and devising entirely original stories and or regions. These projects fall into one of two categories. ROM hacks where people modify an existing retail Pokemon game, and fan games where they build completely new Pokemon-inspired games, usually through a game development engine like RPG Maker XP. Technically oriented Pokemon fans offer all kinds of motivations behind their hobby. These include expanding their technical know-how, developing skills to help break into the games industry, and sharing their love of the Pokemon series by crafting new and interesting experiences. However, as we covered last time, despite all the passion put into these projects, with some going so far as to argue they're protected under different elements of copyright law, such as fair use, unless they receive explicit permission from Nintendo, then these projects are not what you'd call legal, and the creators of ROM hacks and fan games always run the risk that the big N will OCO their project. That's one-hit knockout for our Pokemon fans. Today, we're going to begin talking about two Pokemon fan projects that attracted this kind of attention from Nintendo. One of them is a ROM hack, the other is a fan game. Those are Pokémon Prism and Pokémon Uranium. Has anyone heard of either of these games?
I've heard the name Pokemon Uranium. I don't really know anything about it, other than I feel like I vaguely heard that it's maybe more gritty than the actual Pokemon games. And I don't know anything about Pokemon Prism at all.
Is that one of them there creepypastas? No.
We won't talk about Pokemon Black today, but there is, of course, that Pokemon Black creepypasta.
The one about Lavender Town where the music makes you go crazy.
Oh, I forgot about that one. What about you, Alfred? Have you ever heard of Prism or Uranium?
No, I haven't heard of Pokemon Prism or Pokemon Uranium.
If you were to guess, just by the names, what do you all think that these games might be about?
Well, yeah, so Pokemon Uranium, I would assume something like either there's like a toxic waste element, maybe. I don't know if it's like full-fledged post-apocalyptic or
Nuclear
just
fallout, yeah.
Yeah, or just like, oh no, the power plant had a leak and now uranium spilled everywhere or something. As for Pokemon Prism, now if I were making a game called Pokemon Prism, I would probably like pursue it something along the lines of like every Pokemon is here because it's like the full prism and spectrum of Pokemon. Yeah, that's the only thing I can guess.
With Pokemon or Uranium, I was also thinking maybe more sci-fi. I was thinking more the direction of Pokemon in more of the space sci-fi or universe, Blade Runner sort of. But the post-apocalyptic makes a bit more sense with Uranium. Prism, I was thinking more fairy-type Pokemon, Smurfs, capturing this Pokemon in that more mystical realm was where I was thinking Prism. I was just thinking of like rainbows and seeing the rainbows through the waterfall, and that's where Prism one was leading me.
Yeah, I was not really sure what to make of Prism. Both of you kind of make me think like Rainbow, right? Like the spectrum of light and sort of the more ethereal fairy type characters. I don't really know.
I like all these guesses, and some of them are actually surprisingly close, as we're going to learn. So today, we'll tackle the history of Pokemon Prism and Pokemon Uranium. We'll examine their development and put them in context related to Pokemon fandom as they were being made. We'll then talk in more detail about the ways video game companies have responded to projects that appropriate or adapt elements of their IP, and this will help us set the stage for how Nintendo responded to these games. So with that in mind, I'm going to start today's episode by introducing you to a pair of Pokemon superfans named Cool Boy Man and Involuntary Twitch. Let's start with Cool Boy Man. The son of a software engineer from California, Adam Vieira, aka Cool Boy Man, got into computer programming around the early 2000s when he started community college, which was also about the same time that he got into playing ROM hacks of the likes of Dragon Warrior and the Legend of Zelda series. The blending of these two interests inspired him to try his hands making his own ROM hack based on Pokemon. He recalled in a 2018 Reddit AMA that the feature of Pokemon Gold, Silver, and Crystal, where you travel from the game's Johto region to the Kanto region of the Red, Blue, and Yellow generation, got him thinking about what it'd be like to play a Pokemon game in an entirely new region. And he decided to create a ROM hack with that premise, explaining, quote, "The driving force was that I just wanted to make my very own Pokemon Game Boy game. Back when Gold came out, I was amazed that you could travel to the first game's region. It got me thinking, what else lies in this universe but just goes unmentioned? I drew out several fan regions for fun, and eventually came up with Region, located south of Johto, followed by Naljo, new regions in the Pokemon world that have their own story to tell and lots to discover and explore. I'm a huge fan of world building, which is why I wanted the official game's canon to be connected with my canon, and I tried my best to respect the world that Game Freak had already established while creating something unique for my regions that at the same time wouldn't feel too out of place in the official Pokemon universe, end quote. To that end, Vieira taught himself to code in Hex, an assembly language, designing his ROM hack and cultivating his programming skills through trial and error, and in 2004, he released a finished ROM hack of Pokemon Red he called Pokémon Brown. Unlike earlier hacks, which as we covered in our history of Pokemon ROM hacks, were usually text edits of the original games, including that one hack of Pokemon Blue where your mom basically just tells you to go fuck yourself. Pokemon Brown was an original story set in Vieira's new region called Region. Brown also tweaked some of Pokemon Red's gameplay, and while he didn't add any original Pokemon, known in the fan community as Fakemon, he did create several new Pokemon types and updated existing Pokemon to reflect them. For example, Coughing and Wheezing went from pure poison types to poison/gas types, and Executor went from Grass Psychic to Psychic Wood. Brown also made it possible to catch all 151 Gen 1 Pokemon without trading or exploiting glitches. From reviews I've read, playing Brown is at times a mixed bag. Its gameplay has some annoying quirks, and that's on top of the issues that were already there in the base Gen 1 games, which were filled with at times amazing, frustrating, or otherwise notorious quirks and glitches. And shout out to arguably the greatest fake Pokemon ever, Missing No. Does anyone have any experiences with any of those weird things in the original Pokemon games?
Well, I mean, yeah. So, like, for anybody who isn't that familiar with Pokemon, you can only carry 6 Pokemon with you at a time. And when you catch another Pokemon beyond the 6 that you have, it is instead transported to a box that a professor or somebody else maintains elsewhere. Each box can only hold 30 Pokemon. And in modern games, if one box is full, it'll just move on over, the Pokemon would be deposited into the next available box. But back in the first game, if the box that you happen to have looked at last in the PC is full, then you'll just get a message, the PC is full. And just that Pokemon is just like vanished from the face of the earth. Also, your like inventory that you could carry was very limited. So you would have to store a bunch of stuff in a different PC just for your items. So those are some of the quirky, like quality of life things that I take for granted now about modern games that I first think of when thinking of the old games.
And aren't the boxes now that this might not be relevant, but that's a good way to like transfer certain properties to certain Pokemon? Like if you've got one that has the Pokerus that makes them level up higher and faster, you put them in a box with another Pokemon that has the Pokerus and you can proliferate it?
My understanding about Pokerus is, so Pokemon will only have the active Pokerus virus for 2 days or 3 days or something.
Oh, interesting.
When you put them in the box, that basically pauses the timer, and they can transmit Pokerus when they're in your team. And my understanding is basically after each battle, the game does some kind of calculation to decide if Pokerus has been transmitted to any of the other Pokemon on your team.
Because I had that at one point on my team, and I remember like a friend of mine had one and then transferred it to a Pokemon they didn't care about, gave it to me, I put it in one of the boxes, and basically was able to level up my team pretty impressively. Can we talk a little bit about Missingno? You mentioned them, and I mean, I think that it would be good to just dive a little bit into this. My main exposure to Missingno was I got really into making Perler versions of Pokemon, my favorite ones, and I went online and I saw on Flickr somebody had done all of the first gen. And they had also done, putting a link in the chat here, Missingno, and I didn't know what it was, and I had to go look it up.
Yeah, I can talk about that. And just for context for our listeners who are not familiar, the Pokerus is this random like an event that can happen on a specific Pokemon. I believe they introduced it in the second generation, where basically it creates a kind of buff to stat increases. So it's like one thing that can happen. It's a really low chance, but it could happen. And all of a sudden, then your Pokemon can then get better stat increases at level ups. And yeah, you can hold on to it in a Pokemon box so that you can have like one Pokemon infected with it that you could give it to other ones so that they can have that stat buff too.
I distinctly remember one who had it at one point got a +7 defense after one battle, which is kind of insane. So by the time it was done with the Pokerus, because Andy, you reminded me, yeah, it doesn't last forever. They were a freaking tank. I mean, they weren't very fast, but you couldn't hurt them.
But Missing No or Missing No. I called it Missing No for a long time, and then I watched a Let's Play video not so long where they call it Missing No, which I guess makes sense for what it is. So Missing No is it's not technically a Pokemon, but it's a really weird glitch in the first generation, where if you do a couple of specific things in the game, and Pokemon Red and Blue particularly were notorious for these kinds of weird things that you could do in game that could cause things to happen. So for example, there was a way to trick the game into giving you Mew, and Mew was a Pokemon that was only supposed to be available at like special events that you went to, but there was a way to trick the game into making Mew encounter in the game. Which was discovered like 15 years after Pokemon came out. So it's a quirky game, to say the least. And one of the things was if you did a certain specific set of things, you talk to this person in this one town. It's a guy who teaches you how to catch Pokemon. And you put an item in the 7th slot in your inventory. And you flew down to, what's the town? It's this one island town. And I'm forgetting.
Cinnabar Island?
Cinnabar Island, yeah, Cinnabar. If you fly to Cinnabar Island and if you use Surf, and you go to the specific Pluto land at the far right of Cinnabar Island, and you move up and down there, the game will randomly generate Pokemon that are level 255. And the type that comes out is apparently determined by the letters in your name. So like when I played it, when I was a kid in Pokemon Red, it was Snorlax and Golbat. And it'd be super high level Pokemon. You could catch them, and if they gained a level, this went to level 100. But another Pokemon you can encounter, Pokemon in very big air quotes, was this thing called Missing No. It was a glitch. It was called that because it's short for missing number. It doesn't know what this thing is. It's a collection of pixels that are arranged in like two asymmetric rows. And Missing No, if you fought Missing No, because it has no defense, because it's not a real Pokemon, you could kill it in one hit. And if you did that, whatever item was in your 7th slot, it would have 255. The maximum number of things would be in that. So that's the reason people would like doing that. So you can basically get infinite Master Balls or infinite Carboses or Calciums or whatever. You could catch Missing No. And if you caught Missing No, it could really fuck your game up. So if you catch Missing No and you put it in your party, it's a chance your game might just glitch out. And after you encounter Missing No, if you saw the Pokemon Hall of Fame, which is the thing you get after you beat the Elite Four and become Pokemon champion, they would all be glitched out. They'd all be weird pixels. And there actually are Let's Plays I've seen online of people beating Pokemon with Missing No. It's very hard because it has no defense. It has 2 moves. It has Fly and Sky Attack. And its type is a normal Sky type Pokemon, I believe it is. It's not flying. So it was maybe a leftover for when maybe flying was called Sky.
Hey there, fellow netizens, this is Kevin in the editor's chair. One of the fun things when you go on a tangent like this is that you can throw in a bunch of things that you think you know that you don't actually know. So I actually have a whole bunch of corrections when it comes to Missing No. For example, Missing No's typing. Missing No is actually a dual-type bird normal Pokemon, again, Pokemon in big air quotes, which might have been a holdover for an early part in the game's development when the flying type might have been referred to as a bird type. Missing No in Pokemon Red and Blue also has 3 moves. One of them is Sky Attack, and the other 2 are Water Gun. 2 Water Gun moves involved in this Pokemon. And the other little thing I got wrong was that there is an item duplication glitch, which is the reason a lot of people sought out Missing No in the first-gen games. However, it wasn't you put in the 7th slot of your inventory. It was the 6th slot of your inventory. And if you wanted to learn more information about the glitch, I'm going to include a link in the description to check out more information from the Bulbapedia entry on it. But apologies for the errors here. Sorry to all my Poke fans there, and back to the show. It's a weird, but look it up. It's such a cool thing, and it became like people loved it because you could basically cheat the game and get like infinite rare candies and max everybody up to level 100. And it became kind of a neat meme in the fan community. And there are like, I've seen fan art. I've seen people mock up Pokemon cards of Missing No. I've seen plushies of Missing No. So like, it's one of those weird quirks of the first generation. And Missing No really like encapsulates all the weird stuff that could happen in those games because they were far from polished, those games.
And if you had to physically describe what Missing, because I just shared the Perler one, you just said there's plushies I want to see now. If you had to describe what Missing No looks like.
It's basically 3 vertical lines of just random pixels, like little square of pixels. Apparently there are certain iterations where it'll appear as like a ghost, not like ghastly, but like as a ghost. And other ones are kind of like weird. It'll replace pixels. There's probably one of a Kabutops, and it's a weird Pokemon. It was a weird departure.
All right, just saw the plushie on Etsy. Kevin, my birthday's coming.
It's darling, isn't it?
I want it.
Okay, back to Pokemon Brown. Like I said, reviews are kind of a mixed bag. It's got all those weird quirks that Red had, but it also apparently gets really hard in the late game, which is actually really common among a lot of Pokemon ROM hacks and fan games, is that they have really weird difficulty curves. But nevertheless, Brown was a big deal for what it accomplished in 2004. It was an entirely new story and a new region built with the engine and assets of a retail Pokemon game. And this achievement helped inspire other would-be ROM hackers to devise their own projects. As a representative for Twitch Plays Pokemon explained in a 2016 Reddit post prior to a Let's Play of Pokemon Brown, quote, Pokemon Brown changed ROM hacking completely. Using the fairly solid Pokemon game engine, gameplay-wise at least, it totally revamped the entire game. As a proof of concept that you could use the Pokemon engine to create your very own game with your own story, Pokemon Brown was effectively Genesis. It inspired thousands of people to take up Pokemon hacking and was instrumental in the creation of the hacking community that we have today, end quote. So it's generally acknowledged as a really influential game, this Pokemon Brown, when we're talking about this kind of community. Adam took what he learned developing Pokemon Brown to launch some ambitious projects in the late 2000s. In 2008, he teamed up with a Team Fortress 2 modder who called themselves Hiroshi Sotomura, and the pair announced on their blog that they'd be working on not one, but 2 Pokemon Brown sequels in what came to be known as the Region Trilogy. Cool Boy Man and Hiroshi each took up one of the games. Hiroshi's was a Fire Red ROM hack called Region Adventures that, as far as I can tell, was ultimately never finished. And Cool Boy Man began developing a ROM hack of Pokemon Crystal that he dubbed Pokemon Prism. Pokemon Prism follows the adventures of the child of a famous Pokemon trainer who, while on a camping trip with their mom, gets caught in a cave-in. While finding a way out of the cave, the player befriends a Larvitar, which, for your Gen 2 fans, one of my favorite Pokemon is Tyranitar, who's the evolved form of Larvitar. This Larvitar who helps him make the trainer's way out of the cave and into the Naljo region. While in Naljo, they embark on an adventure to become a Pokemon master in the typical fashion of battling trainers, gym leaders, and the Elite Four. Along the way, they can travel to other regions, including Kanto, Johto, and Pokemon Brown's region, and capture 253 Pokemon across 4 generations, plus Sylveon, the fairy-type Eevee, introduced in a much, much later game, as well as some Fakemon. In addition to iterating on the well-trod Pokemon formula of battling your way to the top of the Pokemon League, Cool Boy Man added some new features, including side-scrolling areas. They look very much like if you've ever played Link's Awakening for the Game Boy. They look very similar to that, these side-scrolling dungeon areas. There are sections where you can play as Pokemon, and there's also a deep, for Pokemon at least, character customization system. The game's battles also integrated abilities, which have been introduced in Gen 3, that gave Pokemon unique traits that could help them in battle. As Vieira began developing his ROM hack, work was already underway on an ambitious Pokemon fan game called Pokémon Uranium. To learn about Uranium, I need to introduce you to someone calling herself Involuntary Twitch, also known as Oripoke. Like Cool Boy Man, Involuntary Twitch was a Pokemon fan looking for new ways to make her own mark on the series. However, where Cool Boy Man combined his love of Pokemon with his growing interest in programming, Involuntary Twitch applied her passion for the series into graphic design, specifically designing her own Fakemon inspired by the sprite art style of the mainline games. In 2007, around the start of her freshman year of high school, she sat down with a classmate who went by the online handle JV, and the two decided to make their own Pokemon fan game. Twitch later recalled that the pair first came up with the game's title and worked backwards, using the name as a starting point for both the game's story and art direction, calling their project Pokémon Uranium. As she explained during a 2017 Reddit AMA, she came up with the name Pokémon Uranium, quote, simply because that was the only cool-sounding metal that hadn't been used in a Pokemon fan game yet, end quote. Involuntary Twitch acted as the game's creative lead, setting the overall art direction, which was in the style of Gen 4, which for those unfamiliar is Pokemon Diamond, Pokemon Pearl, and Pokemon Platinum, doing all the sprite work, designing a line of 150 Fakemon, and crafting Uranium's story. JV, meanwhile, was the game's technical lead, designing Uranium in RPG Maker XP, which, as you learned, is a design platform for developing role-playing games that became a popular engine for designing Pokemon fan games, especially when it was supplemented by things like Pokemon Essentials, a toolkit that gave resources to develop Pokemon games. Pokemon Uranium takes place in the Tandor region, a region inspired by Rio de Janeiro that is beset by a series of horrible nuclear accidents that have created a dangerous new Pokemon type, the nuclear Pokemon. So, Andy, you're pretty close. Not quite a post-apocalyptic, but nuclear meltdowns do play in this game. You play as a teenager who 10 years ago lost their mother in a meltdown at a nuclear power plant. Starting your adventure in Moki Town, you meet the local Pokemon scientist, Professor Bumbo, who gives you a starter Pokemon and charges you and your rival with researching the region's native wildlife. Along the way, you capture and train Pokemon, battle your way through the region's Pokemon League, face nuclear Pokemon, and uncover the mystery of what really happened to your mother 10 years ago. So any thoughts so far before we move on?
Well, yeah. Sounds like I was also on the money regarding this being a more gritty take on things than the mainline Pokemon games. Although it is kind of funny that they provide an in-universe reason for a parent being missing, as opposed to most other Pokemon games where you have a mom and just no dad. And then nothing is ever mentioned, which at least always led me to assume that, at least in the very first game, that Professor Oak was Red's, illegitimate father.
He was really trying to introduce some actual scandals into Pokemon horror.
Professor Oak, dog.
Gives a whole new meaning to his ask, oh, are you a boy or a girl?
Who's your mother?
That story with the mom dying, I wasn't expecting it, because Pokemon really is kind of this really G game where it's just, happy. You're just going out to explore the world, but that's a little bit deep. That's deep for a Pokemon game. So
that is some Disney level parental loss.
What did your mother say about your father?
I must catch these Pokemon to help feed my family.
Did she talk about me?
But that is also neat. So the nuclear Pokemon type is neat. I mean, because I would tend to assume that most Pokemon are probably using the, what is it now, 18, 19 types that exist. So yeah, so creating nuclear Pokemon is like a whole new gameplay wrinkle of just figuring out like what are nuclear type attacks super effective against and what are they weak against. I assume there are some nuclear versions of existing Pokemon and some new Pokemon that are nuclear type. So it sounds like an interesting starting premise.
Yeah, I'm looking it up because I've watched some Let's Play videos. I'm looking this up just so I'm certain about it. But the nuclear type is, in terms of a type, is kind of like a glass cannon. Apparently got really strong moves, but it's basically weak to everything. Let me see. The nuclear type is... Oh, no, it's actually the reverse. It is super effective against everything. It is
like the kid who has all the plays the superhero with all the superpowers.
So nuclear type is almost like the dragon type. Basically, dragon had only two weaknesses. Dragon was weak to ice, and dragon was weak to dragon. And eventually, that's why Pokemon introduced the fairy type, which is super effective against dragon as a kind of way of nerfing the dragon. Because you can have like a Dragonite in your party and just wreck everybody, because those things are tanks. According to the wiki of Pokemon Uranium, nuclear is 2 times effective, so it's super effective against the following types: normal, fire, fighting, water, flying, grass, poison, electric, ground, psychic, rock, ice, bug, dragon, ghost, dark, and fairy. It is only not very effective against steel and nuclear itself. If I recall, it's like some of the defenses is not very good to kind of offset the fact that its moves can basically just wreck everything.
Hey there, fellow netizens. This is Kevin in the editor's chair with a brief correction here. I was oh so close to being accurate about the nuclear type, but it wasn't quite right. So it is true that nuclear type attacks are super effective against every type except for nuclear and steel types. However, what's also true is that every move is also 2 times effective against nuclear type Pokemon. So normal, fire, fighting, water, flying, grass, electric, ground, psychic, rock, ice, bug, dragon, ghost, dark, steel, fairy, and poison are also all 2 times effective against nuclear type Pokemon. Also, there are 2 different types of nuclear type Pokemon in Pokemon Uranium. They're natural nuclear types, and then they're corrupted nuclear types. And the thing with corrupted nuclear types is they are existing Pokemon that have some sort of nuclear effect to them. They also run the risk, like a traded Pokemon, of disobeying orders until you get to a point later in the game where you can make it so that they don't disobey orders anymore. So, going back to my earlier point, nuclear type is a glass cannon type Pokemon in that they're super effective against mostly everything, but they're also super weak against almost everything, and there's a good chance, depending on the nuclear Pokemon you use, that it'll disobey you. So apologies for the error there. Back to the show.
But yeah, that's the nuclear type. It's like a very schoolyard thing. My type is a type that beats all the other types.
If any of you played Pokemon Coliseum or Pokemon XD or the GameCube, the only Pokemon you could catch for the most part in those games were shadow Pokemon, which were Pokemon who had been corrupted in some way by the bad team. And you could catch them, and then, you could gradually, purify their hearts. But shadow moves were super effective against any non-shadow Pokemon, regardless of type. So yes, nuclear type kind of reminds me of that, which also then makes me wonder if there's a mechanic wherein you can, de-radioactify nuclear Pokemon to make them a non-nuclear type Pokemon.
Decontaminate them, yeah.
Yeah.
I do know that
Also,
there are.
no question. Hang on. Why steel? Why was steel the only one that is not effective against apart from its own type? Like,
If I were to guess, steel is naturally immune to poison. And I assume if we're talking about radiation,
are we using real logic now?
that's my guess.
But lead is a steel. Like if I were to make up a lead-based Pokemon, I would make it steel type, and so I would argue that steel Pokemon have the properties of lead, and so they block radiation.
All right, so your Pokemon Pencil Point, who you're making up, is going to be super effective against what's one of the radioactive ones called, Kev?
Let's see. I got a whole list in front of him. One of the pure nuclear types. For example, Eevee has a new evolution called Nucleon. But there are corrupted nuclear types that are various. Some of them are Fakemon that Involuntary Trish created, and some of them are mainline ones. Like there's a nuclear type Magikarp, which of course can evolve into a nuclear type Gyarados.
I've been following along these Pokemon podcasts, and it's been really cool because I've just been on the outside. I've always known about Pokemon. In fact, here I've got my case for some of my Pokemon cards that I'm playing with my kids. I've always been a Pokemon fan, but I haven't played a lot of these games and seen a lot of the things that you guys have seen. Some things I knew. I knew that each Pokemon game kind of opens up new regions, that allows for new exploration. And Pokemon Brown was creating those different regions here. And now Pokemon Uranium is creating this new dynamic type of Pokemon. And also the introduction of a little tiny more mature storyline. I kind of, in my mind, was wondering where they're going with this. You see, Pokemon's a game where, like Japan, it's divided up into different regions. And now you've got each region. And as far as I understand, in the Pokemon games, you go to a region and you basically battle your way up until you get to the master of that region. Then you have to conquer that person and move on. Now the dynamic of a nuclear Pokemon makes me wonder, are there other aspects to this game Uranium that they're introducing now? Because you have these different regions, you're going around and conquering the different regions, and now you can have a nuclear type Pokemon. Are you now going to be negotiating trade between those different regions? Are you going to be establishing dominance between Johto and Region? What are type of adult aspects to this game might they be introducing in Pokemon Uranium?
There is turmoil in the Pokemon Senate.
Or actually, if Pokemon Uranium's region is the only one with nuclear Pokemon, then I guess that region is the only superpower, and it gets to just swing its weight around on the global scale.
The Poke Doomsday clock has gone to 11:55. So yeah, that's Pokemon Uranium. So let's talk a little bit more about its development. So JV published the earliest footage of Pokemon Uranium on his personal YouTube channel on November the 12th, 2008. And shared a development thread for the game on the fan project website Poke Community 3 days later. And as we talked about in our previous episodes, Poke Community is this gathering point online where they share information about their projects. And it's really common to have this sort of active development thread that people share, and the developers might share builds of the game so they can help fine tune it. And that's a really common thing. The early build gained a positive reception for Uranium, and as of this recording, that Poke Community thread has been viewed over 290,000 times.
Now, I just want to come back to this term Fakemon. I just want everybody to think about, how do these new types of Pokemon feel when we call them Fakemon?
There's some really impressive ones too. If you look online, like there are people who this is their whole part of the fandom, is they'll design new types and design new evolutions and they'll design entirely new Pokemon. It's neat.
I just want to say, who decides who is a Pokemon and who's not a Pokemon? Is it Nintendo the only originator of Pokemon? Are they the gods of the Poke universe?
I mean, as we're going to learn in these episodes, yeah, basically. That's Nintendo's basic stance. Development on both Pokemon Prism and Pokemon Uranium progressed slowly. It still happened with fan projects basically developed by kids in their spare time. I should point again, these were developed by people mostly when they're in high school and college. And so they're kind of doing them on and off. And over the years, both teams cultivated a small online following, with both teams occasionally posting updates on their respective websites, interspersed with periodic rounds of open beta testing. As we covered in our previous episodes, both ROM hacking and fan games rely heavily on open collaboration and people helping each other troubleshoot and fine-tune their projects. In the case of Uranium, JV posted regular updates to his development thread on Poke Community and periodically posted short videos of the work in progress on his YouTube channel. He also looked to expand the team working on the game. On August the 11th, 2012, he put out a call for experienced sprite workers and music developers to help on the project. And about 3 years later, on July 11th, 2014, he published the game's first official trailer, which attracted over 160,000 views by the end of the year. All the while, Pokemon maintained its steady following in the gaming community. People still played the games in earnest and consumed the brand's various associated media, such as the anime and the movies. However, it's safe to say that through the 2000s and most of the 2010s, Pokemon was not the massive pop culture sensation that it was following its mid-1990s debut. With that in mind, let's fast forward to what I'm sure was most people's favorite year of all time. A year that nothing catastrophically bad happened whatsoever and set the tone for many good and happy years to come. 2016.
Boo.
What happened in 2016?
Well, I'll tell you what happened in 2016. It was a really big year for Pokemon fans in 2016. And nothing else happened. Don't look that up. So 2016 was a pretty big year for Pokemon, marking the series' 20th anniversary. And Nintendo lined up a bunch of special events and offerings to commemorate 2 decades of catching them all. On February the 27th, 2016, Nintendo released Pokemon Red, Blue, and Yellow on the 3DS Virtual Console. Sad update, if you haven't downloaded them already onto your 3DS, you can't, because Nintendo shut down the service on March the 27th, 2023.
I was going to ask you about that. I wrote that down because I was like, ever since I've been listening to this podcast, I've been saying, I want to start playing those old games. And I looked up where I could play it. It was the 3DS. And I can't get them.
You know what, though? They've begun adding Game Boy titles to Nintendo Switch Online. So I wouldn't be surprised if eventually they make their way there. Pokemon Stadium is on the Nintendo Switch Online. But one funny thing is, so I had gotten Pokemon Yellow on the 3DS back in the day, and they kept all of the original code and glitches. So I looked up how to get a Mew as well, and I got a Mew. Unfortunately, I believe they won't let you bring that Mew into Pokemon Home. So
for God's sake.
It'll just have to stay stuck there. But
I hope they do bring him to Switch, because the Switch can't play through the television, so I can play him with my kids. Like, we can all be together, switch the controllers around and play.
Yeah, they did introduce this year that the Switch will now have Game Boy games as you get the yearly Nintendo membership. However, knowing Nintendo's track record, they just drip feed all these games that no one's maybe thought about or heard of for many years gradually. If I were to take Nintendo's timing, the way they're going to release these Pokemon games, give it maybe 6 years. Maybe they'll have Pokemon Red in 6 years. In the meantime, you could own a copy of the original games if you don't mind going on eBay and spending $200, and maybe, just maybe, that's a real copy of it. The retro collecting scene, particularly for games like Pokemon, is insane. It's overinflated, and it's riddled with fakes, which we'll talk about in our next episode. They're not making it easy, but for a little while in 2016, Nintendo honors the 20th anniversary by releasing Red, Blue, and Yellow on the Virtual Console. And a couple years later, they put Gold, Silver, and Crystal on it too, which you also can't get, because if you didn't already download them, they've shut down that ability to buy them now on the eShop. People could also bring their games to participating retailers and get various legendaries like Mew, Celebi, Jirachi, and Darkrai, as well as obtain commemorative Pokemon cards to add to their collection, or possibly use to hilariously scam Logan Paul. Nintendo also released several new Pokemon games throughout the year. These included Great Detective Pikachu, Birth of a New Duo, was released exclusively in Japan for the 3DS in February, Pokken Tournament, a Pokemon-themed fighting game that released for the Wii U in March, and a pair of new mainline games, Pokemon Sun and Pokemon Moon, that came out for the 3DS in November. However, all these new Pokemon games released in 2016 paled in comparison to the pop culture sensation that was Pokemon GO. Anyone here have any experience with Pokemon Go?
A little bit.
I remember Pokemon going to the polls that year.
So Pokemon Go came out at an interesting time in my life in that my children were young and I was still wrestling with how much access I wanted them to have with phones and eye screens and all that type of stuff. I thought it was a really cool idea, and I know they played with some friends, but I didn't really get them active into it. Only recently, I was at a meeting where they were discussing leadership, and they were talking about geocaching, which was something that years ago I purchased, but we still hadn't done. And they were saying Pokemon Go and geocaching are very similar. And so we haven't actually played the Pokemon Go, very familiar with it. And it's something probably as teenagers, I'll let them kick it with when they are allowed to have a screen that they can take around with them. Because it's a cool idea. We did the geocaching last weekend for the first time, and we had a lot of fun as a family doing it. So I think Pokemon Go is a great idea.
There was a colleague of mine who, at work, made it a point to go to several areas on site because they were known Pokestops to like check in and get rewards and stuff for her kids because she was doing that. Again, she was kind of running the game for them on her phone. I also remember there was a guy in our neighborhood here, Kev, you might remember this, who one of our neighbors was like, couldn't figure him out because he would just walk around with two cell phones, one in each hand. And we were like, what is he doing? What is he doing with those phones? And it turned out he was running Pokemon Go. One phone was his, one was his kids. And so it's like whenever he went out, he would do it for both of them. I also remember I've played Pokemon Go and I learned, I'm still neutral, even though I've been playing for a long time, and apparently that's a big deal. I wasn't doing that on purpose. I just didn't know you could pick sides. And also, my pride and joy is one time I caught a Pikachu with a little green hat, and I named him Roxana.
And Kate, you bring up like this mom who's walking around. Pokemon Go is one of these places where it's allowing a different way to interact through a video game. I don't know if she plays video games or not, but she can contribute to this experience with her children in a way that they appreciate, which is really cool. And Pokemon Go, bringing you away from the screen into the world to interact, it's just really cool. The place that I was talking about, they were talking about some of the problems, which is, I guess you can like block your area from participating, because they were talking about, because this was like a youth center, youth retreat, and they were saying they wanted to allow both those, but then they realized, hey, we can't have random strangers coming in looking for the Pokemon. While we're having these kids programs.
The guy comes in with the two phones. Excuse me.
I feel like even just recently, or maybe just in the last couple of years, but years after Pokemon Go began, that there were still like military sites were having people show up because Pokemon were spawning there. And it's just weird to me that wouldn't have been discovered earlier.
Well, wasn't there a thing, I could be wrong about this, but wasn't there even a thing where there were like Pokemon could spawn on private property by accident, at least in the first wave in like 2016?
I feel like I remember hearing reports about that.
People were like not necessarily breaking into people's houses, but were like coming onto people's lawns and stuff, and freaking folks out in Niantic, I think, got sued over it.
In today's America, you definitely can't have that anymore.
Dude, yeah. Yeah, I wanted to listen, dude, put the AR-15 down. I just wanted to get a Squirtle.
I got to get that Magmar. Come on, man.
The Magmar's wearing a little hat. It looks like, I'm just looking, I just posted this article from The Verge. It looks like there was a lawsuit.
Oh, look at that. Yeah. So in 2019. So there was
Pokestops near their houses, yeah.
A class action suit filed in 2016. This is from that Verge article. Plaintiffs claim that Niantic's game had encouraged players to trespass on their property, sometimes blocking the driveway with cars, quote, peering into their windows and littering or damaging property. Court filings revealed last year that the case had been settled, but they didn't specify what the settlement included. And I'll put a link in the description. Thanks for sharing this. So yeah, Pokemon Go. It was now I work in museums, and it was kind of a big deal for museums because the game was built on a system that used a lot of, public locations. And so a lot of museums ended up being Pokestops, and a lot of museums use that as an opportunity to encourage visitation. Come out, check out the Pokestop, and while you're here, why don't you learn something? So that was kind of a neat part of it. It was a kind of a halcyon summer, I think, for some people, where it got people really excited. People were going outside. Now, I'm not going to say it was a perfect system. Pokemon Go is not a perfect system. It definitely favored people who lived in high density population areas, people who live in suburbs, people who live in cities. So like I've heard complaints from aspiring players who, for example, like if you live in a rural area when there's not a lot of locations around, it's also not a very accessible game. It's very hard for people with certain disabilities to play it. Matter of fact, there's actually a controversy going on right now, and I didn't put this, maybe this might be a separate episode, in the community, because they said these things called remote raids, where people would go as like a group and go to different sites. During the pandemic, they wanted people to still play, and so they allowed people to do them from their home. And with the, the apparent end of the pandemic, or at least people deciding that the pandemic is over, Niantic, the company that made Pokemon Go, has been rolling back those things and making it harder to do raids remotely. And so there have been calls for things like boycotts and mass deletions in the Pokemon Go community, because it's now a lot more hostile to people in rural areas and disabled players. But depending on where you were, your experience might be pretty fun with that. And I actually have a really weird story with this. So Niantic, the company that makes Pokemon Go, actually built this game on top of another game. For those of you who aren't familiar with Pokemon Go, it was developed and published by Niantic in collaboration with Nintendo and the Pokemon Company. Pokemon Go was an augmented reality or an AR-based mobile game where players could go to real-world locations and find Pokemon on their phone, which they can then catch, train, and battle. And you could go to different locations called Pokestops to either earn points for the game or, actually battle. There were gym battles and people could capture sites. And this was built on another game they had made called Ingress. And I got a really wild story there. Ingress is basically the same as Pokemon Go, just strip the Pokemon Go stuff, with one big exception. So Pokemon Go has 3 factions. Ingress has 2. The framing device for Ingress is just like an alien invasion, and the 2 factions are called the Enlightened and the Resistance. And a fun thing about that, the Resistance basically outnumbered Enlightened players 3-1. There was a massive imbalance. That's why I think there are 3 factions in Pokemon Go. But I got a random story, because I work in museums. First time I ever heard about Ingress was a guy called me up to organize an event at the site I was working at and says, we noticed that there's a bunch of Ingress sites, the equivalent of Pokestops at this place. So we want to have an overnight and we want to just go and get the stuff and get points and everything. And I said, that sounds pretty cool. So I started looking up this game. I downloaded it and I'm talking to this guy over a couple of phone conversations. And I had signed up for the team he was opposite. I decided to try the Enlightened. Why not?
Well, because, wasn't everybody part of the Resistance in that one?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It was because everybody wants to be part of the Resistance.
If everyone's in the Resistance, it's not a Resistance.
Yeah, they basically outnumbered players like 3-1. Like, it was super unbalanced. But this guy, when I told him that, got really weird and really uncomfortable and stopped talking to me to book this event and started talking to my boss. And told my boss that they were concerned that I was going to go with all of my Enlightened buddies because, I have so many of them, and go to all the stops that were at the site and take them all up away from him. And he got real concerned about it. So it was so funny. And it's like, dude, I don't care.
How old was this guy? How old was he?
He was about 13, 14? I think, no, he was like in his, I think I met him once. He was like in his 40s. But it's like, I did not care. And when I saw how unbalanced the game was, and people have been playing so long that it was basically impossible to capture any site, I deleted the game. It wasn't fun. It was completely unbalanced and broken. This weird experience I had with that. I'm sorry if that was a departure, but I feel like that's a neat thing about this.
So you were quickly inspired to make an egress from Ingress.
Yes. But yeah, so I built on this game called Ingress, which was unbalanced and broken, but people loved when they put the Pokemon layer on it because it's just so damn appealing. The thought about going outside and catching an actual Pokemon. And people loved it. It was a big deal. It was a phenomenon in the summer of 2016, which in no time at all, thousands of people running hither and yon for the chance to find a Pikachu or Bulbasaur at their local park, museum, or Canadian military base. The game also attracted its fair share of anxiety, and some level-headed defenders of moral virtue of the Helga Zepp LaRouche variety likely stymied from their usual complaint that video games keep kids from going outside and socializing, warned of other potential ills, such as the greater risk of trespassing or possible injuries as young Billy chased that pesky Lickitung into a nearby freeway or whatever. However, my favorite attempt at a moral panic comes courtesy of the rational actors in charge of the UK's Daily Mail. And a side note, the Daily Mail is going to come up in at least one more future episode I'm planning. Who ran an article in the July 11, 2016 edition with the not at all insane headline of, quote, "Is this the world's most dangerous game? Fear's new Pokemon Go app craze can be used by pedophiles to lure unsuspecting young players," end quote. Way to go, Daily Mail. Alas, I have yet to find any evidence that Lyndon or Helga Zepp LaRouche had any insights into the dangers of Pokemon. And if you missed that, check out our previous episode.
Hey there, fellow netizens. This is Kevin back in the editor's chair. And so this is where we'll wrap up the first half of this episode. So I hope that you'll tune back in for the remainder of the second part of this when we dive more into the talk about Pokemon Prism, Pokemon Uranium, and start talking about the ways that different video game companies respond to fans who appropriate their intellectual property. That episode again will drop on Tuesday, June the 20th. So I hope you'll be there for us. In the meantime, that will do it for today's episode of Scandalous Games. If you like what we're doing and want to help the show, subscribe or follow us wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a rating. If you want to learn more, check out our website, scandalousgamespodcast.wordpress.com, where I publish the show notes and the sources for every episode. Our theme music is Occam Seekweed by Seek Knowledge via the Free Music Archive, used under a CC BY NCSA 3.0 US license. If you have a question, comment, or idea for a topic for a future episode, email us at scandalousgamespodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, I'm Kevin Impellizeri, and speaking for Andy Hunter, Elford Stephens, and Kate Lynch, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time for the next part of this episode, and remember to subscribe to Fat Will Gaming on YouTube.